Hey guys, we're going to do some more figurative language for Casey at the Bat. So you need your copy of your poem out. This should be in your interactive notebook already. We taped it in the other day. If you don't have a copy, then get a copy off of the cart, or you can print another copy from Google Classroom. But you need to have the poem somewhere. We have multiple copies of the poem. So find your poem, and what you're going to do is you're going to label figurative language in the poem. Okay, so let's review some terms for figurative language. The first one is alliteration. We talked about that yesterday. It's the repeating of identical consonant sounds, most often in the beginning of words together. For example, the beautiful butterfly blew by the bay. We've got beautiful butterfly blew by bay. So the repeating consonant sounds. Okay, metaphor. You've known a lot about metaphors. We've done a lot of that in school over the years. So metaphors are comparison between two unlike things, but they do not use like or as. So here's an example. Recess was a zoo. Okay, that means recess was chaotic with lots of different people running around. It was not literally a zoo. Okay, it's just a figure of speech. So a metaphor compares one thing to another, and it does not use like or as. On the other hand, simile is the same thing. It compares two unlike things, but it does use like or as. So here's an example. She is as pretty as a picture. We see it's comparing her to a picture, and it's using as. So if it uses like or as, it's a simile. Okay. Next, we have idioms. Idioms are sayings. They're common sayings, like a piece of cake or it's raining cats and dogs. They're sayings and expressions. Okay, so example, solving that puzzle was a piece of cake means that the puzzle was easy, not that it was something to be eaten. It was just easy. All right, so there's lots of idioms. Some are a little more complicated than others, and sometimes we have to look up what some mean. Okay. Onomatopoeia is a word that imitates the natural sound of something. For example, buzz, slurp, meow, pop, fizz, clop. Those are all examples of onomatopoeia. Okay? Hyperbole is an exaggeration beyond belief. It's an exaggeration. My father can lift 2 tons. There are 1,000 people calling my name. Okay? You're just exaggerating. So it's a hyperbole is an exaggeration. Personification. The word person is in personification. So personification means giving human characteristics to non-human things. So, for example, the trees sighed in the afternoon breeze. The tree cannot actually sigh, like, okay? But it says they can't sigh but seem to as they move gently in the breeze. So personification gives person-like qualities to things that are not real people, okay? So let's look at your poem, Casey at the Bat. You should have a pencil nearby. If you want to use a highlighter, you can. I have some highlighters in the back of my room underneath the cubbies in a little tray, or you can just use a pencil. But I need you to go through and find these stanzas. We're going to go stanza by stanza and make notes in it where you see these types of figurative language, okay? So pause the video as you need to. Pause the video and get out your poem. Okay, so let's start. So the first 2 stanzas. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville 9 that day. The score stood 4-2 with but 1 inning more to play. And so when Cooney died at first and Burroughs did the same, a sickly silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to the hope which springs eternal in the human breast. They thought if only Casey could get a whack at that. We put up even money now with Casey at the bat. So I want you to find an example of personification, okay, an example of hyperbole, an example of alliteration, an example of onomatopoeia, and another example of alliteration. So over here to the right, I want you to label, these are going to be labeled somewhere in here in these two stanzas. So if you need to go back and look at what these are, you will go back in on our slide, the back here to find what those mean, okay? But you, either with a highlighter or your pencil, you're going to write over the word, find the word, and write over it that this is an example of personification, hyperbole, alliteration, automatopoeia. Okay, so this one had, in these two stanzas, there's two examples of alliteration. There's examples of automatopoeia, hyperbole, and exaggeration, and an example of personification. So look, read each line carefully and find those examples. Okay, pause the video while you find those. The next two stanzas. But Flynn preceded Casey, as did also Jimmy Blake, and the former was a pudding, while the latter was a cake. So on that stricken multitude a death-like silence sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey's getting to the bat. But Flynn let drive a single to the wonderment of all, and the much despised Blakely tore the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted, and men saw what had occurred, there was Blakey safe at second, and Flynn a hugging third. So in these two stanzas, you have an example of a metaphor somewhere, an example of personification, an example of hyperbole, an example of alliteration, and another hyperbole, which is an exaggeration. So pause the video, take your pencil or your highlighter, and find examples of each of these in your poem. You're going to write on your copy of your poem that's in your I&B. Okay, the next two stanzas. Then from the gladdened multitude went up a joyous yell. It rumbled in the mountain tops, it rattled in the dale. It struck upon the hillside and rebounded on the flat, for Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearing, and a smile at Casey's face, and when responding to the cheers he lightly doffed his hat, no stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. So I want you to find an example of hyperbole, an example of automatopoeia, an example of alliteration, and here's a new one, imagery. Where does it say, what lines in there really describe something? Like you can picture it, you can picture something, and it just creates a picture in our mind by giving details. So find an example of imagery. Pause the video so that you can do that. Next, here are the next two lines. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then while the writhing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance flashed in Casey's eye. A sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by the sturdy batsman the ball unheeded sped. That ain't my style, said Casey. Strike one, the umpire said. So find the example of a hyperbole, an example of personification, and find another example of imagery, a description. Also, I do want to point out that we didn't talk about this, but what is a leather-covered sphere? They mentioned a sphere, and that's a shape, right? It's kind of a round shape, like a ball. So that's what they're talking about, the baseball, when they call it a leather-covered sphere. Pause the video so you can label these things. Okay, the next one. From the benches filled with people there went up a muffled roar, like the beating of storm waves on a stern and distant shore. Kill him! Kill the umpire! Shouted someone on the stand, and it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of honest charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult, he made the game go on. He signaled to the pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew, but Casey still ignored it, and the umpire said, strike two. So here's spheroid, just like the sphere we read in the last stanza, okay? So now I want you to label a simile, and alliteration. Remember, a simile uses like or as. Alliteration is the repeating sounds. Also, I want to point out, yesterday we talked about repetition. Kill him, kill the umpire. Okay, we have repetition here. Okay, and we also have some examples of assonance and consonants. And you already know how to do rhyme schemes, so there's so much in this poem that we've learned about. Pause it so that you can go ahead and label several things. Okay, the next one, fraud, cried the maddened thousands, and the echo answered, fraud. But one scornful look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold, they saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey wouldn't let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lips, his teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel vengeance his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go, and now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Find an example of hyperbole here, which is an exaggeration. Also, notice some more repetition. Fraud, fraud. Those are examples of repetition. See if you can find any other examples of any other types of figurative language or consonants or assonants and label those now. Pause the video so you can label those. And the last stanza says, oh, somewhere in this favored land the sun is shining bright, the band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light, and somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout, but there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. I want you to find an example of metaphor and of repetition in this part. Pause the video. Okay, so now you should have your entire poem, Casey at the Bat, labeled with lots of things. We know what a stanza is. We know what lines in a poem are. We know how to do rhyme scheme. We know about repetition and rhyme in poems. We know about different types of figurative language like similes, metaphors, personification, hyperbole, alliteration. We talked about assonance, consonants. So you know all of these different things, and you've read about what the poem's about. You know the characters in the poem. You know the setting. You know the theme. So we've talked about all those things, and you have a test over this on Friday. You need to be studying your vocabulary words. You can use Quizlet to do that, and you need to be continuing to read your book. So when you finish with all of these, this video, then you need to get out your AR book and read, or you may also practice your vocabulary words and study for your test tomorrow. If you're finished with everything, then you can listen to episodes 61 and 62 and 63 on 6 Minute Podcast.